Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar focused on optimizing B2B revenue operations. I'm so delighted that you could join us. As we start, so just for our folks kind of joining from Australia, I want to acknowledge and respect the traditional custodians of the land from which each of us is joining. I extend my respects to the elders, both past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples tuning in today. For those joining from New Zealand, I extend similar acknowledgement to the Maori, the Tangata Whenua, and I'll just kind of go ahead with the karakia. Te tau mai runga, te tau mai iraro, te tau mai waho, te tau mai roto. Kia tau ai te Maori tū. Te Maori ora ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. So as we may touch upon kind of Salesforce products today, it's just important to note that forward-looking statement of Salesforce as usual. So any purchasing decisions should be made based on products and services currently available. Lastly, also we kind of encourage your active engagement. So please submit any questions to our panel through the Q&A button on your screen. We have set aside some time at the end for a Q&A session, so feel free to kind of bring your questions in. All right, let's dive in, and I hope you find the discussion both kind of enlightening and valuable. So today's discussion will just explore the importance of removing complexity and streamlining processes across the entire revenue operations value chain, from all the way from kind of lead generation through accounts receivable. So our experts will share kind of best practices for optimizing each stage of the revenue operations process in order to improve customer experience and drive profitable growth. So I'm the moderator for today's session. My name is Rui Fonseca. I had the Revenue Cloud practice within CloudWorks. So I've been within kind of the Salesforce ecosystem already for quite a long time. And for probably the past 10 years, I've been more into this kind of revenue lifecycle management domain, which will be definitely kind of focusing on today. I'm joined by kind of two industry leaders, two kind of legends within this space: Brian Schurz, the Senior Vice President of Product Management at Salesforce, and Max Rudman, the Chief Executive Officer of Prodly, leading release management platform for Salesforce applications. So I'll just let you guys introduce yourself. So Brian, could you please just tell us a bit about yourself and your experience in revenue operations?
Sure. Thanks, Rui. Great to be with you and Max today. I started my career about 30 years ago in CPQ and have basically never looked back. After several years at Oracle, Aptus, and various other implementation partners, I joined Salesforce about 5 years ago to drive growth of our CPQ and billing products into what is now known as Revenue Cloud. And for those that don't know, Salesforce Revenue Cloud is a suite of products that focuses on improving efficiency across all of revenue operations.
Thanks, Brian. It's such a pleasure to have you with us. Next up, over to you, Max. Would you just introduce yourself and provide some background on your involvement with revenue operations as well, please? Just unmute, Max.
Oops, sorry about that. Yes, absolutely. Great to see you, Rui and Brian. So honored to be on the panel with you. So my journey with CPQ and revenue lifecycle management space, it started about, 17 years ago now. I sort of fell into it by accident. I was hired by a Salesforce consulting firm to build a quoting app for one of their clients. And that's where I saw the opportunity, the CPQ opportunity. And this is what became SteelBrick, which many of you know was acquired by Salesforce in 2016. and is now part of the Revenue Cloud offering, which Brian so aptly oversees.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian, Max, for joining us today. Let's jump right in with some questions. So revenue operations can have varying interpretations. So I'd love to hear your views on what it entails and why organizations are increasingly prioritizing it. We've also noticed the emergence of the Chief Revenue Officer role, so CRO. So could you share your thoughts on this trend and what you're observing among the customers you work with? Brian, let's start with you.
Yeah, Rui, I'd say that the evolution has been largely driven by the move from companies of every industry from traditional one-time sale products to various forms of recurring revenue, like as a service, software as a service. As a result of these transformations, sales and finance must work closer together to ensure that each customer experience, what I refer to as land, expand, and renew, follow the same governance and are able to be integrated with downstream systems, including revenue recognition. What's interesting is that there's been a convergence of sales and finance, primarily because of this growth of deferred revenue. And when businesses sold complex equipment, sales did their job, the factory did their job, finance sent out an invoice, and the customer made a payment. But when we move to these recurring revenue models, what we see is there's much more interplay between sales and finance. And this is largely why we used to refer to sales operations. We now refer to them as revenue operations. And there's a very important role they play along with the CRO to ensure the price is right, operation is right, governance is being followed as it relates to amendments and renewals. But there's also an important role that finance beyond the revenue operations team plays that goes beyond discount approvals. We need to make sure that revenue is properly recognized, which is much more complex than when it was a one-time charge. That cash flow can properly be forecasted, again, especially if there's a consumption component, is much more difficult than simply one-time charge products. And that proration calculations are consistent with whatever contracts are in place with the customer.
Thanks, Brian. Max, what about your views on it?
Yeah, I would say I see the same thing that Brian does, except for my view is maybe a little bit broader. I think it's not just about, sales operations and finance. I think in my view, it's really reflective of sort of the changing world, of which a transition to a subscription economy is certainly part of it, but also, with obviously the internet and the World Wide Web, the dissemination of information is so much easier now, right? Buyers are so much further into their buying cycle by the time they engage with an organization. And so I think that's just highlighting that need to integrate various teams, so not just sales operations, sales and finance, but also marketing and customer success, right? Really along that entire customer life cycle, from prospect to through the buying journey, through onboarding, usage deployment, usage of the product, and obviously hopefully resulting in renewals. So, and I think the CRO, the trend of the CRO, the emergence of the CRO role is just, in my view, the different side of the same coin, right? Just like you need to integrate the operations teams that support those various functional teams along that customer journey and revenue lifecycle. You also need one leader to oversee it, and kind of what exactly that means is different for different companies. Broadly, for example, we have a CRO; it's responsible for sales and customer success. In other companies, I've seen CRO responsible for sales and marketing. And yet other companies, it's all three. So that kind of varies by company. But I think the idea is the same, right? It's just to provide a coherent, integrated experience for customers as they go from the very first time they heard about your brand and engage with your company, through purchase, through evaluation, purchase, onboarding, deployment, and then hopefully renewal.
As B2B organizations like navigate through these recent challenges like the pandemic, economic downturn, have you noticed any additional trends from a revenue operations point of view? So how do you feel that like organizations are adapting their approaches in response to all these circumstances that have been kind of thrown at them over this kind of latest periods? Brian, would love to hear your take on this one first.
Sure, Rui. What I would say is certainly as a result of the pandemic, there was a huge global shutdown and business needed to continue to sell while not able to go visit their customers. And so I think there was a huge explosion of self-service. And we've always talked about a move from direct selling to e-commerce or self-service selling. And I think in some ways the pandemic accelerated that. But the reality is it doesn't result in a lack of a need for a direct sales rep. What it resulted in was the enablement of buyers and sellers to work together in this digital environment. And so we've certainly seen B2B customers accelerate their movement to e-commerce along with their movement towards recurring revenue. But they don't always believe that customers can buy in purely a self-service mode, in a self-service mode. So how did that affect revenue operations, folks? Well, if I had a direct sales tool with a product and a price and a quote and an order, and I have a self-service tool with a product and a price and a quote and an order, and I had a couple this move from one-time sales to recurring revenue, I'm now faced with this new world where these two channels don't necessarily align. So when I had two separate systems, I could place an order, amend it, renew it in that system or in the other system. But now we need to converge these and be able to place an order in one system and amend it or renew it in the other system. And what this meant was that the direct sales tool and that e-commerce tool now needed a unified master data and a unified transactional engine that allowed us to interact with our customers at any point in their customer journey through any channel of their choosing.
Thanks, Brian. Max, so from your perspective, how kind of organizations adapting to this kind of new reality?
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything Brian said. My view is maybe again a little bit broader. I think the pandemic sort of instigated this massive transition to these digital transformation projects, and what they are kind of varied by company, right? For some companies, probably laggards, it meant upgrading their CRM. Others deployed, Revenue Cloud to streamline their, CPQ and subscription billing processes. Yet others probably deployed, B2B commerce solutions, as Brian alluded to. But, what I certainly saw that aside from kind of the initial freeze up in economic activity and the sort of the paralysis in the early months of the pandemic, ultimately, it resulted in this massive expansion of IT budgets. And like those were the boom years for all of us in the software space, right? Organizations were buying software left and right that could help them go digital and improve their business system so they can be more agile and show up better in this new digital world that so massively accelerated during the pandemic. And now, of course, we're starting to enter a different phase of the economic cycle. There's some economic headwinds. And what I'm seeing now is the revenue operations teams as well as IT teams have to cope with, reduced budgets, right? During the heydays, it was like, here's all the money you need, just go deploy these software applications, deploy the software that can get me digital, money is no object. Now it's all right, well, if you have a limited budget, you probably have limited headcount, maybe you can hire as fast. So now the task is to maintain that pace of digital, maintain the digital transformation that has happened during the pandemic, but do it with a lot less resources. And, I think that's a really interesting problem, right? Because you got to stay agile. In fact, during the lean economic times, you arguably need to be even more agile. And, but now you got to do it with less people, with less budget.
Yeah, Max, that's a really good point. We came out of the pandemic and, it's all systems go. And then boom, there's economic headwinds. And then couple on top how we bring everybody back together and back to work. And by the way, you can't spend any money anymore.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of brings us to the next point, which like these kind of two extreme kinds of compelling events that kind of drove organizations towards this kind of challenges and those decisions. So I think one thing we see is that always, like, a lot of organizations are driven by compelling events that make them kind of reevaluate and enhance their own kind of revenue lifecycle processes. So in terms of your kind of previous experiences, like, could you share an actual kind of real life or example of such events that led to such significant changes? So that kind of us and the audience can learn and understand the actions that have been taken by those organizations and the outcomes that they achieve in response to those events. Max, will you go first on this one?
Sure, absolutely. I'm sure there is a ton of examples in, the broader Salesforce ecosystem and, even in the Revenue Cloud business. But I'll give you one that is probably one of my favorite ones that I had a firsthand experience with. We have a customer called Amex, American Express, GBT, Global Business Travel. We signed them up sort of, say, like right in the beginning of the pandemic. And, they had a digital transformation project already going on, in fact, specifically the Revenue Cloud implementation. But, as you can deduce from the name, they provided travel services to the corporations, right? And as we all know, there was not a whole lot of that going on for much of 2020. And so, they really had to pivot fast to find new sources of revenue. And, I think they did that successfully. And, to me, that's a great example of, deploying software like Salesforce in general, like Revenue Cloud in particular, to drive that business agility that I talked about earlier, that enables you to move on a dime when a situation like the pandemic arises. So I always really like that example. I think they did an amazing job pulling through that difficult time. It was a difficult time for everybody, but especially for folks in the hospitality and travel industries, and they pulled it off.
Thanks, Max. Brian, any real life examples from you? For sure, there's many.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, as Max alluded to, we're at the cusp of one of those compelling events right now. We see it in the news almost every day, chat, tweet, whatever. But in my lifetime, in our lifetime, in our professional careers, we've seen major disruptions of technology. I think back to Y2K, which wasn't necessarily a technology disruption, but it certainly drove the adoption of ERP. If we fast forward, Salesforce, with SaaS 20-something years ago, the introduction of software as a service changed a lot of things for us. The iPhone, right? How revolutionary has the iPhone been in our career, in our lifetime? But fast forward to today, and we've been talking about machine learning or artificial intelligence for a few years now, to do things like price optimization, where doing math faster made sense. But it feels like we're at this place where, with the introduction of ChatGPT, we can fundamentally change the way businesses do business. And it's exciting to see where this is going to go for us.
Yeah, definitely. So for those organizations that are kind of about to start something like this, in terms of kind of focusing on their kind of revenue kind of operations processes, etc. And streamlining all that end-to-end process is basically kind of crucial for kind of their growth and also for customer satisfaction. So could you kind of provide some best practices in terms of how to optimize each stage of that process, of the revenue operations process? And kind of considering the wide range of organizations, how can they determine like what will be the starting point for their improvement efforts? Brian.
Sure. You know, I always tell people when I ask this question that the number one thing is to start with what I refer to as a phase zero. Before anyone puts any fingers on the keyboard, my recommendation is always that we start by understanding what problem we want to solve and what all of our options are for how to solve it. Along the way, we have to be willing to change anything, to change everything. I like to say that lift and shift is not a viable transformation strategy. So be willing to think beyond the ways you've always done it. In my experience, most companies do things the way they do because, you know, in air quotes, that's the way we've always done it. And the reality is they've always done it that way because the technology of the day forced them into doing it that way. And so if you're changing your technology from a spreadsheet to cloud software, don't re-implement the way the spreadsheet made you do it, right? And that's hard. And that's, you know, sort of the people, process, and technology conversation that ultimately needs to be had. So we like to say at Salesforce, start with a beginner's mind, go into it willing to change whatever needs to be changed, leverage the technology to enable that change. And once you've sort of sorted that out and understood the policy changes and the process changes required, then let's start implementing software.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess like from my own kind of experience in terms of helping organizations with these kind of journeys, yeah, that openness in terms of being able to be open to change, in terms of leveraging those new technologies and to adjust their own kind of processes and in the way they do things too, it's definitely critical for kind of for success, so that they get to that kind of outcome that they are happy with and that they will be comfortable with in terms of kind of driving their business. Max, I'd love to hear your take on this one.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Brian. I think this is probably the experience that all three of us share, having been into the weeds of, you know, CPQ and Revenue Cloud implementations. You know, this is the biggest obstacle to success, is lift and shift and trying to kind of replicate, you know, what you had in the previous system, whether it was another piece of cloud software or a spreadsheet. So taking back or stepping back and taking a fresh look, I think to me is one of the key drivers of success. And, you know, what I would certainly encourage, sort of piggybacking on Brian's point about this holy trifecta of, you know, people, process, and technology, you know, as much as we hate to admit this being the software vendors, the technology is always the easiest piece. So really look at your people and look at enabling your people and look at the process, right? And in that, I would just go back to sort of the first principle of revenue operations, right? Revenue operations are the teams whose objective, whose goal is to support the cross-functional revenue teams, and, you know, that are organized around this revenue lifecycle, and revenue comes from customers. So build it around the customer. And, you know, as Brian said, have the beginner's mind. And this is by far the hardest thing to do. And, you know, something I've seen over and over again, where, you know, they just choose to fight, you know, a different battle. And they, you know, it really becomes super focused on, you know, we had this process in the old system, how can we replicate it here? Nobody even asked the question if this makes sense even anymore. So start with the customer, start with the process, and start with phase zero, which is just saying, don't boil the ocean. And I think you'll be well on the path to success.
So as we talk about success in terms of those journeys, like one of the key things is how to measure that success from a revenue operations point of view. So when it comes to kind of metrics and kind of how to determine those. So considering kind of the diverse stages of organizational maturity and different types of businesses, what are some of the key metrics that companies should focus on? And additionally, are there specific like indicators or guardrails that could help predict the success or failure of these kind of revenue operation and revenue operations initiatives? Max, your take on this one.
Yeah, I think again, in my experience, the biggest determining factor is sort of not trying to boil the ocean, as Brian called out, and starting with a phase 0, it's being open to questioning assumptions and revisiting processes. And as far as sort of the metric for success, I mean, I think it's really hard to pin down in any particular metric because it varies so greatly and it depends on the customer. I'll give you one sort of example that always stuck with me for some reason. One of our earlier customers was a company called Cloudera, which makes business intelligence or a big data solution that's built on top of an open source platform. And I just remember they sort of figured out that, look, the biggest predictor of success for their customers was selling a professional services engagement with, maybe it was training, like I don't remember the details, but basically selling some services with the software, which makes perfect sense, right? This is sort of complex software. You need to deploy it properly. You need to make sure that customers understand how to use it, get the value out of it, which of course is a necessary prerequisite for renewal. And I just thought it was so great because it was such a simple thing to do, right? Like it fits perfectly in the use case, in the wheelhouse of CPQ, right? Suggesting another product when you pick some other product. It was so simple, both to build and to measure. And, that really proved the value of the solution, right? Again, it doesn't have to change your entire business, right from the start, but pick something like this, like that metric, right? Like this attach of services to software that you determine is important to drive renewals, and focus on a use case like that. Maybe pick a couple, 3 of those. And I think I actually thought it was brilliant. It sort of proved value very quickly, and was really easy to implement.
Awesome, thanks, Max. Brian, how would you see kind of any of these kind of key metrics that could be used for measuring success on these type of initiatives?
Well, I will say that more often than not, project success starts with project governance, right? Customers have a strong executive sponsor, a functioning steering committee, and a realistic project plan. They will generally be successful, whether they're on time or not, they'll be successful. And they're going to be successful to get the outcomes they were looking for. And this kind of goes back to Max's point about, pick those things you want to solve. Because if we do this in an agile process, we can solve the first set of problems, gain some success, and start solving the next set of problems. But that assumes that you started with a good plan and the governance to stay on course, not to get scope creep, et cetera. If you're, so use the technology to play that role. Think about the impact on the people, process, and technology, and always come back to the why or why not, right? We've always done why, right? We can't do it that way. Why not? Right? Ask those questions and get to the root cause and drive that fundamental change.
And thanks, Brian. I think as we touch on kind of technology as well, I think often we see a lot of organizations struggling with numerous technologies across their kind of their revenue cycle, life cycle processes, that kind of lead to departmental silos and a broken value chain. So what advice can you offer organizations with legacy systems that recognize the need for change? How can they approach this challenge from an architectural perspective to create like a more integrated and cohesive revenue operation structure? Brian?
Yeah, I'd go back to my previous answer. Start with phase zero. Phase zero is where we want to think big and then start small. But if we think small and start small, then we often find ourselves boxed in a corner. So think big in phase zero. It's safe, as I mentioned earlier, to think about sort of what I want to be when I grow up. And then how do I get there? And that's the time to do it, because everybody can free flow ideas, brainstorm, whatever. And through that process, we're going to get down to what really needs to happen. And it's easier to debate it in that open forum than to rewrite code when you did it the wrong way. So have that conversation, get all the ideas on the table, and then execute on that consensus plan. And then I'd say, just repeat what Max said earlier about boiling the ocean. It's just such a great sort of thing to keep in mind, is we don't need to boil the ocean here, certainly not in phase one.
Yeah, and I'll have to echo what Brian said. And I'm a big fan of this concept in general, in business systems and product development, as well as design as far ahead as possible, but build as little ahead as possible, which is just another way of saying, focus on what's important, on what's most important right now. And then the other piece of advice I give is just stay away from corner cases. I think this is where I've seen a lot of customers get tripped up, right? And trying to kind of get to that 100% automation. That last 20% is what kills you, right? This is where you go off the rails, you go custom. It's just stay away from it as much as possible. If something happens like once a year, it's okay. You can do it manually.
Yeah, definitely. The 80-20 rule is definitely key. So we are coming to the end of our kind of discussion, and has been kind of great insights from you both. So I'll just like to ask a final question before we kind of answer some of the audience Q&A as well. From your perspective, like what does success look like in terms of revenue operations? So when an organization effectively streamlines their revenue operation processes, what benefits would they kind of expect that they can kind of retain from that, and from that journey and from achieving that state? Max, you first.
I will again go back to sort of the first principle of revenue operations, right? I think success in its broadest term, like what the specific metric is for you, is going to be different. You have to think about that. But broadly speaking, it's about, again, revenue operations is about supporting revenue teams. It's about the integrated, cohesive, and frictionless revenue lifecycle centered around the customer. If you can drive that with your revenue operations, then mission accomplished.
Brian?
Yeah, I would second everything Max just said and summarize it with profitable growth, especially in these economic times. Think about how do we make sure that we're profitable, that we're generating cash, and growth is still always important, but maybe growth is not as important, right? Keeping the business running, adding new customers, increasing customer adoption, are all important things to be thinking about, right? And if we do that right, then the expansion and the renewals are driving revenue growth as we continue to land net new accounts. So, for example, in CPQ, we're going to put in pricing guidelines or guardrails to help the approval process, so we can improve profit margin through CPQ. With billing, we're going to make sure that we've got a more perfect order that ensures we've got a more perfect invoice, which as a result should improve cash flow, right? So we want to think about these same tools we've used to grow the business now to ensure that we're growing the business profitably, that we're controlling the cost through automation, that we're improving cash flow through improved data processing, et cetera.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Max. So I guess before we conclude, I just want to provide an opportunity for both of you to share like any final insights or words of wisdom with our audience. Is there anything else you would like to add or any key takeaways you'd like to emphasize? Brian, you first.
Yeah, so really, I would just say, it's great joining you and Max on this webinar today. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. And ideally, the next one would be in person down in your neck of the woods. So look forward to seeing you in person next time.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Max?
I'll throw my hat in the ring for an in-person. So glad to be finally getting back on the road and meeting with customers and prospects in real life. So looking forward to that. But one thing I did want to say, which is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, is that when you think about all these, transformational projects, whether it's just general digital transformation or CPQ or revenue cloud implementations, they get these are high calorie projects, get a lot of attention, and rightfully so. But what I wanted to point out is that the go live is not the end, it's the beginning of the journey. So think about how you're going to make changes. How are you going to keep getting value from these systems? Because their value lies in changing in their constant updates and constantly making changes to them. Like the example that Ryan just gave is a perfect example. Like we've shifted from kind of growth at all cost mentality to this profitable growth, right? So reconfiguring the systems to prioritize margins and prioritize efficiency is a great example of where business agility is just so critical.
Great. Thanks a lot. Just want to, I think before we finish, I just want to extend a massive thank you to both of you for being here today, sharing your incredible insights on how to streamline B2B revenue operations. I guess we've gained a much deeper understanding of how this approach can lead to great outcomes, such as maximize profitable growth, improved efficiency, and ultimately, of course, happier customers. I guess it's crystal clear that simplifying and optimizing these processes throughout the whole revenue operations value chain is just an absolute game changer for success in the B2B world. So once again, from bottom of our hearts, a big thank you to Brian, Max, and all of you that our fantastic audience for joining us in this journey. I'll definitely like to encourage you to continue the journey with us in the B2B Next Gen series. We'll further explore strategies to harness the power of data to drive growth. So that's our next session. So register today to secure a place and access any that you may have missed on demand as well. So we'll share the QR code on the screen. So and then also the recording of this session will be sent to you. So I guess now we can jump into the Q&A from the audience. And I'll just go one by one. So the first question we have is basically how can companies with manual systems tackle the challenge of streamlining revenue operations from a technical standpoint? So what advice do you have for organizations that recognize the need for change but have existing systems in place? Brian, I'll throw this one to you.
Sure. I think at this point, everybody has existing systems in place. And so we need to think about how are we going to handle that cutover, right? And this sort of goes back to this idea that there's an existing process that's driven by this existing system. And one approach is install the new software and lift and shift the business process from software A to software B. And as we've discussed today, I think that's the wrong approach. The right approach is to understand what are the friction points between you and your customer in that existing system, and how might I eliminate that friction if I were to deploy a new system. And there's probably a lot of these, and it sort of goes back to the boil the ocean, then prioritize them and decide where to start. We can't replace everything and start a new system and completely transform it. So we need to figure out what the right bite-sized chunks are. What are the strategic places to begin? But understand that some of those strategic places have prerequisite. I want to implement a new CPQ system, for example. But before I implement that new CPQ system, I need to rationalize my product catalog or rethink the way I price. So we want to understand what are the big things that are going to give us the greatest value, but we also need to understand the level of effort and the prerequisites. From there, we can start to prioritize our phases and begin that transformation as we convert to a new business system.
Thanks, Brian. I'll jump into the next one. I guess this one, Max, is directed to you. How did the pandemic speed up the shift towards self-service sales, and how did it impact revenue operations? Can you share a specific example of B2B customers using e-commerce for self-service sales?
So I'll start with the first part of the question. I mean, obviously, self-service, is, in my mind, at least, it's sort of the subset of e-commerce, right? But hopefully, the driver is obvious, right? When you can't go to the store, when you can't go to a physical location, you got to transact business online. And that's sort of the acceleration of the transition that pandemic has precipitated. Like, that transition was on the way already, mind you, right? This is just a massive acceleration of it. For an example of a company that's using e-commerce, you know what? I'll actually give Salesforce. I mean, there is, the checkout, there's a store that Salesforce has put sort of renewed effort in. You can go and you can see your contract. And I think, to me, like, that's the perfect, example, a use case for what Brian calls self-service, right? It's not necessarily that, well, everything is going to be bought online through a website like you would go on Amazon, but it just means that, even in a very complex sales cycle where you most definitely need a sales professional to advise you and sell you on the machinery, let's say, but then, replacement parts, maybe some consumables if you're in life sciences, right? These are the examples of self-service use cases where the contract, the pricing, there's no ambiguity, there's no price negotiation. It's literally just this very tedious and mechanical step of ordering part A or part B. And so I think Salesforce does a good job with this. Like, if I want to go add a license to my contract, right? Like, again, unless there's a price negotiation that happens, I don't really need a technical salesperson. So I can just go and do it online, and I'm happy. They're happy. Everybody's happy. And by the way, we did do this at Steelbrick with our own software, right? If you want to go add a CPQ license, you just hire a rep, you get a new CPQ license mid-contract. Again, there's nothing to talk about. You have your price, and unless you're like doubling or tripling or quadrupling the size of your contract, there's no negotiation. I just want to get a license, buy it online, self-serve myself, and everybody's happy.
Brian, anything you want to add on top of that?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about a customer. I won't give their name, but we had a point of sale customer that was an existing CPQ customer, and when restaurants and stores shut down, point of sale devices didn't really mean much. And so this company launched a new product that allowed their customers that couldn't get customers into their restaurant, for example, to use their point of sale device to buy food, launched a new product that allowed their customers to launch an online takeout service. And so it's interesting because the pandemic forced the business to rethink the products and services they sold to their customers, which enabled their customers to continue to provide the products and services they sold to their customers. And it all became sort of a self-service tool. And of course, the point of sale happened through the online order. So I think it's interesting when you realize that there's these opportunities to fundamentally run the business differently. And sometimes, what do they say, that necessity is the mother of all invention, and so we see several examples like that during the pandemic.
Thanks a lot, Brian. All right, let's jump into the next one. So are there any specific training or skill requirements for employees involved in Revenue Cloud implementation and revenue operations? How can organizations ensure their workforce is adequately prepared? So I guess I can kind of start on this one, because that's something that typically face this with kind of a lot of engagements. So I think when adopting a partner, like a qualified partner, is in terms of based on the technology that you're implementing, is definitely key. That can help navigate all of that and can like provide all of that knowledge and advisory into the whole journey. So in order to kind of guarantee success, and I guess talking about our example in specific, so from an enablement point of view and from a training perspective, that's always something that we typically bring into our engagements, is to have kind of actual customer team members along the way throughout all the journey, so that they can kind of start getting enabled along the way through the whole life cycle of the implementation of for that project, so that at the end, when it goes live, they're already kind of up there in order to being able to tackle and to maintain the system from that point onwards. I guess, Max, I think you earlier alluded to that, yeah, like go live is just step one, right? So then you just need to continue kind of nurturing and continue kind of evolving the platform. It's that kind of land and expand type of approach. So Max, any other anything else to add to this one from your side?
Yeah, I would say, probably the biggest thing you can do is, the most important thing you can do is to invest in training, right? Like, you don't need to become an expert on CPQ, on billing, on whatever application you're implementing, right? That's why you have SIs like CloudWorks that have that expertise. But and unless you're a really small organization, then you plan to kind of completely outsource the admin of it, through managed services. But if you plan on taking ownership of the deployment at some point, like, you need to know what you're doing, and you need to have a base level of understanding, right? Because as with all these applications, and especially in CPQ and Revenue Cloud in general, it's one of the more complex spaces, one of the more complex categories of enterprise software. So you really need to invest in training, so that really everyone, the product management, the revenue operations team, the IT team that owns the solution, has the right level of baseline understanding for their function.
Just jump on the next one. So how can organizations make the most of their limited resources when implementing digital transformation? Are there any strategies to prioritize resource usage? Brian, I'll throw this one over to you.
Yeah, so I think, sort of building off the last question, I just want to throw in Salesforce Trailhead, right? So Salesforce has great resources available to our partners and our customers to help them learn how our product works, but also to understand some of these business concepts. And so I think it's important that you leverage those, because they can help to manage these limited resources and the scarcity of time. I don't need to send you off to California for 2 weeks to learn this. We can spend an hour an evening or whatever in independent learning through Trailhead. It's great. It's integrated with the product and sort of test your skills, etc. But beyond that, I think it goes back to the prioritization. To say that it doesn't take a commitment of your key resources would be a falsehood. We need your best and brightest to understand how to transform the business, and there needs to be a commitment of their time. But we also need to, as leaders, recognize that their time is precious and we don't want to waste it. So finding ways to enable them and empower them to make the right decisions for the business, have all the information in front of them, and focus on the things that are most important, because I think you can start a snowball effect. Max talked about the first things first. If we can have a phase one where we solve sort of 3 key problems, often what happens is the dividend is we get some more of that resources time, because we've eliminated some manual steps in the process, right? So we're going to consume that extra time of those scarce resources as we automate processes, and we can start to snowball through and transform the business.
I guess we're kind of definitely approaching our time. And I'll just go for the last question. This one's for you, Max. Can you tell us a little bit more about Prodly and how it supports revenue operations?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. Prodly provides lifecycle management solutions for Salesforce in general and Revenue Cloud in particular. And sort of speaking of the best and brightest, training is one resource, one piece of help you can give them. Giving them the tools to take the tediousness out of their job is another. And Prodly was born out of the pain that we had at Steelbrick with deploying CPQ projects between sandboxes and onto production. I have this running joke that with my second company, I'm solving the problem I created with my first. And what I'm referring to is that CPQ, as well as many other low-code apps on Salesforce platform, are primarily configured with data as opposed to metadata. And that's the gap that we set out to solve at Prodly, is filling, providing a tool that can make it a lot simpler and a lot faster and a lot more accurate. But of course, now, we are focused on the entire application management lifecycle, sort of end to end from ideation through delivery. And I think it's something super important to think about to ensure continued success of these projects and to ensure that you continue to consume value from something as transformational as Revenue Cloud.
Thanks a lot, Max. Again, I think we're reaching the end of our session. Max, Brian, thank you so much for being here today and share your incredible experience and insights on the topic. It's been a great session. Thank you for everyone that has been able to attend it. We'll definitely encourage you to continue the journey with us in the B2B Next Gen series. So you can see on the screen the QR code for enrolling into the next session, which will be kind of focused on data, basically the power of data to drive growth. So you have and also like the recording of this session will be sent to you, so that you can kind of dive into more detail if you want. Once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this, and we'll definitely see you around. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roy. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.